we normally give people 5 minutes after to get started. We gave the chairman 5 minutes after to get here, so we'll start now at 10:10. I appreciate your indulgence of our time and being with us today. We are, as a committee, looking to be proactive and not put things off till session that are sort of investigatory in nature. Many of you who have been at the Capitol for years know that the 40-day shot clock of the legislative session is not the time to understand things, draft things, file things, act on things, and pass things that are thoughtful. That doesn't happen in a legislative session. So we've been trying to kind of lean ahead of that this year and understand some issues that perhaps might need some consideration legislatively, or as we dig deeper and deeper into the onion of an issue that decidedly does not need any action. Sometimes what we don't do is more important than what we choose to do. So with that point in mind, today's hearing was prompted really some time ago. Representative Gilligan has looked at the issue of data privacy both from a security standpoint and from the perspective of business entities having access to information and being traded and sold, and which is all part of our internet economy. But what are reasonable expectations of privacy for citizens? What are not? All those issues come to us, and I don't think any of us as legislators have those answers. So today is going to start a long process of looking at what are conditions with respect to private data, largely in the hands of private entities. What's the duty of care for protection? And as we started on this path of scheduling this meeting and kind of moving forward on a commitment to talk about and probe into these things, there have been some very prominent data breaches in our community and nation that's popped on the radar screen of many. So we were, Representative Gilligan bringing this to me perhaps is ahead of her time. So there's no particular focus on this, but it's, I think, an issue that's timely for us. It's one that we want to understand as legislators, that perhaps we act, perhaps we're best advised to not act at all or to wait. And with that, I'd like to recognize Representative Gilligan briefly. If you could tee this up and introduce your speakers today, and then we'll recognize the speakers and get into the hearing. Representative Gilligan.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I did start down this path on cybersecurity and privacy data actually because of something that happened in my own home county, where our tax commissioner had inadvertently released information to a private citizen that contained social security numbers of several thousand citizens of Forsyth County. So it was not listed as a breach because he had released it, but everybody knows that my personal computer is nowhere near safe enough for that kind of information. Now, it was not my computer. It was a citizen who notified us about it. But that started me looking into the Georgia Code and what can we do to protect citizens, and how can we make sure that all entities, whether they're private entities or public, such as the government, what are the best practices that we can do to ensure that citizens are protected? I was asked then if I could lead this particular discussion, and in doing my research, I found the InfraGard organization. So the InfraGard Alliance is a national alliance, and the president of the local chapter is just about walking through the door now, and I'll finally get to meet him face to face. Trevor Horowitz, who will be actually beginning our presentation. So thank you very much, sir. He has been very responsive to every request. Usually if I send an email, it's amazing how quickly I get a response from him. So I want to thank you for that, sir, and thank you for your time. Sorry about the parking situation, but hopefully you can catch your breath and be ready to present to us in just a moment. And then he also suggested David Katz, correct? Who does the legal side of what we're looking at, and hopefully we can find ways to bring Georgia into the 21st century as far as protecting privacy data. So between the two of these men, hopefully you can ask lots of questions, and they're experts in their field, and they'll be able to get us down the right path.
Thank you, Representative Gilligan. Mr. Horwitz, Katz, thank you for being with us today. I can assure you we're going to ask some questions that are going to make you uncomfortable. Particularly if you're in private practice, you have existing cases and clients that you're in federal court with or state court with. So I would ask you, rather than to make artful dodges, which I'm sure you can execute with stealth and a silver tongue, just tell us, you know what, I really can't address that. I've got a case that's going to kind of keep me from talking about that. But we are looking today to kind of probe into this. If there's things that perhaps you don't have expertise on, but you sort of have some tangential knowledge of, just kind of represent that and tell us. But our goal is to begin the process of delving into this question today, and I just appreciate you guys being such a meaningful part of it.
Let me start off and apologize. Let me apologize for my tardiness. So first order of business would be can you guys do something about the traffic in Atlanta?
No. I think there's a real commitment to do something about traffic. The question is, there's harsh division about what's going to solve that. But appreciate your being here. And again, you've got the mic. Members, we will entertain questions as we go. I would like the presenters to be able to kind of get through the core of their presentation. If there's a clarifying question you have that you don't understand what they've said, ask the question. And I want this to be more of a discussion than anything else today. And again, for purposes of administration, when you've got the floor to speak, you've got the floor. So you can take as much time as you like asking questions. I will reel you in if I think you've talked too long. But if Representative Dyer has 6 questions for the speaker, you kind of take those and you'll invent some questions as we go. We'll let you kind of work through that. But I just appreciate the members being here today. And with that, Mr. Horwitz.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure. It's my pleasure and honor to be here, and thank you for your time. Again, apologize for my tardiness. I'm here today representing really myself. My name again is Trevor Horwitz. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for a cybersecurity compliance and services company here in Atlanta, based in Atlanta, called TrustNet. I'm also the president of InfraGuard Atlanta. If you're not familiar with InfraGuard, InfraGuard is a FBI private industry cooperation between private industry and the FBI. And the goal of the InfraGuard is to protect America's critical infrastructure. More than 80% of America's critical infrastructure is in private hands. And this is a way for the FBI to interact with private industry to put forward and share information and basically to build bridges to protect, again, critical infrastructure from our enemies. We have approximately 1,000 members in the chapter in Atlanta, and there are about 83,000 members of InfraGuard nationwide. In order to join, you have to go through an FBI background check, but other than that, again, it's a private industry and public cooperation. And I'm here with my colleague, David Katz, and I'll let David quickly introduce himself.
Sure, thank you. Again, thank you so much for inviting me to provide some testimony today to this committee. It's really an honor to be here. So I lead the privacy and data security practice at Nelson Mullins Riley Scarborough, located in Midtown Atlanta. And I've been spending a lot of time helping companies respond to data breaches, comply with their obligations under many state laws, helping them evaluate the risks that exist as a result of security breaches that could occur within their businesses, developing compliance programs to help mitigate those risks, and working with folks like Trevor to conduct investigations to determine what happened within these companies and assess the legal obligations. So I'm really excited to talk to you about some of those experiences and to tell you what we've seen, how other companies have reacted, and some of the recommendations that we have in terms of what might make sense going forward. So thank you.
So our agenda today really has 4 primary items. The first thing we're going to talk about is data privacy and the collection of personal information. We're going to talk about data privacy and the law, and David is going to handle that. And then we'll talk about how we can prevent data breaches. And then we have some specific recommendations on action items, going forward. We're not able to get the presentation up?
I think it's, I think with the
Okay. This is actually a picture of America's Most Wanted, the two guys over there. If you see them, please let me know. So the first question, firstly, let me just go back through the agenda. We're going to talk about data privacy again, a collection of personal information. David's going to talk about data privacy and the law. We're going to talk a little bit about how to prevent data breaches, and then again some recommendations. And we've left some time for some Q&A. So firstly, what is driving the collection of personal data? So this is a big question. Why do we need to collect all this data? What's behind it? Well, information is to this century what oil was to the last. Information is driving growth and change. And it's extremely powerful. We have an age now where we can collect information that we previously have been unable to collect that information. And the gathering of that information is propelling different type of businesses, it's propelling commerce, it's propelling change. It's propelling political change, propelling change in business, change in people's lifestyles. It's propelling change across the world. The IDC, which is a research institute, predicts that by 2025, we will have 25 zettabytes of data stored. I don't even know what a zettabyte was. I thought it was a type of pasta, but apparently it's not. A zettabyte is basically, it's 25 with 21 zeros behind it, bytes of data. If you took all that data and you put it through a broadband pipe, it would take about 450 million years to go through that broadband pipe. So we're collecting data at a tremendously rapid rate, and it's continuing to grow. Not only the rate of data collection, but the storage of data collection continues to grow. So really, what's driving this trend, and how is data being collected? Well, the first way that data is being collected is through mobile devices. Mobile devices collect geo-tracking location. It can collect data through beacons. If you're not familiar with beacons, beacons are a near-term signal that interacts with your mobile device and can actually interact with your mobile device without you even being aware of it. Obviously, there's phone calls and text messages which are also being collected. But let's not forget about things like Apple Siri and Google OK, which are apps that are collecting information. You can query them, and all of that data is being collected, along with all the smartphone apps out there. And all of this is personally identifiable information. From an e-commerce perspective, we also have retail purchases. All of that data is being collected, customer loyalty programs, financial records, health records, cameras, and facial recognition. This is kind of a growing area. When you walk into a retail store today, the trend now is where the store will actually track your face, and as you walk into that store, it will identify you as perhaps a big customer, and you may get special attention if you shop at that store regularly. This is not something out of the Matrix or out of a movie. This is happening in real time right now in retail stores across the United States. The Internet of Things. Internet of Things is devices that interact with the internet that are not typically computers or mobile devices. So think of fitness trackers, drones, Nest devices that control temperature, the Ring doorbell, medical devices. Today are almost universally medical devices now connected to either through Bluetooth or network connection, sharing data. Kids' toys, pervasive. You find these toys all the time. They're able to download software, interacting with the internet, all collecting information. Some of them have cameras recording children's reactions to it, interacting with them. And let's not forget about Amazon's product, Alexa, and Google Home. Both of these devices have the ability to collect a fortune of information. was a case recently where Google had a bug in their software, and the Google Home device was basically on a listen always mode, basically recording everyone's conversations. So that was in a limited distribution of their product. It was a software bug, and they provided a patch, but only after it was found out by a researcher that this activity was going on. But what this is leading to, again, is just the pervasiveness of how information is being collected. And let's not forget about our government. State government, federal government, we're all collecting information, court records, legal transactions, licenses, travel documentation. I mean, this is what government does. This is the job of government, to collect information, to sort it. Survey data, and also a fortune of camera information, from law enforcement all the way down to border control. All of that data is being collected, all of this personal information. The bottom line of all of that is we have a fortune of information that's being collected, and it's being collected everywhere. As a kid, I grew up, I may have mentioned I grew up in South Africa, and I remember reading the novel 1984 about Big Brother, and we've arrived. It just took about 2 decades more than George Orwell predicted. But we are in an age where a fortune of information is being collected, and is really being collected on a random basis. A lot of this information we're collecting it because we can, not because there's necessarily a purpose for it, but because we think there may be a purpose for it. And frankly, we don't even know in a lot of industries about what the usefulness of this information will be. We just know it's good to have. And for a lot of organizations, in their process of going about their ordinary business, they're interested in collecting this information because they may be able to monetize it at some point down the road. And you take large companies like Google and Facebook, they're collecting terabytes of data on a daily basis, and they have no idea how to monetize that data today. But perhaps there's going to be a customer comes along to them, in a couple years' time and says, "Hey, we're interested in XYZ. Can you get the data for us?" And there's a way for them to monetize it. I'm not picking on Google and Facebook. They just happen to be the ones that are at the top of the list. But that's pervasive across all industries, from retailers, Target, Walmart. They're all collecting a fortune of data and all figuring out new ways to use their data. Before David talks about privacy, I want to add one more little quick kind of case study, and that is a case study that I read about Target. Target has the ability to collect information and to look at trending patterns, to the extent that they could actually tell when someone was pregnant before that person's their spouse or partner actually knew that they were pregnant, maybe even before the person themselves knew they were pregnant, based on certain buying patterns. So they can predict, because of how many cases they've looked at and the fortune of data they've got, of how someone interacts and how their buying patterns will change when they're pregnant. So it was a fascinating case for me, being in the cybersecurity side of the house, about how this data can be used and how this data can be so pervasive, and go into our everyday lives and things you don't even realize you're doing. A lot of it is subconscious, but someone's tracking it and has the ability to detect patterns and use their data to their advantage. And with that, I'll hand it over to David.
Thank you, Trevor. That was so terrifying, such a good summary within such a quick period of time. I wonder, should we open for questions?
Yeah,
I'm happy to start my...
We're going to do that.
Okay, yeah.
You stirred the pot adequately. No. Actually, before you get started, I'd like to give the committee members a chance to ask some questions to Mr. Horwitz, which is good. Could you, you're welcome to take the podium or back at your seat, whichever is most comfortable for you. But any questions from committee members? Okay, no, because I've got one. Maybe I'll incite some. I love what you said about the modeling for things that have heretofore been seen as sort of private prerogatives. I was before you said that about pregnancy, I made a note here. You think about, I think back to the day long ago when I was 28-year-old and my wife and I were looking to have kids. You have, oh my gosh, woman thinks she's pregnant, she buys a pregnancy test. And then within 2 days, she buys a second pregnancy test, right, to confirm that. If to me, there's a real marker. A woman who's never bought pregnancy tests before, buying 2 pregnancy tests within the same week is a marker of she's very likely pregnant. And then all of a sudden you can start being marketed by people. I mean, I share that sort of parenthetically as sort of a member of our community, sort of laughing about this. That kind of thing, consumer purchases, I understand these things are sort of bought and traded. Is that completely open source information that a woman buys 2 pregnancy tests in the course of a week? Or is there some level, is there any duty to not share that in today's legal structure?
Yeah, I mean, so the way that companies typically handle this is they make disclosures publicly to individuals about how their information is being used. And, typically a responsible company is going to be following generally accepted privacy principles. Oh,
Could you use the mic?
Yeah. Yeah, and so they're going to be, if they're good, responsible, companies using data, they're going to be offering notice, consent, and choice about the way that information's handled and processed. And so they're going to be bound and held to the statements that they've made to those consumers. The issue, I think, more importantly, is what is the consumer expectation around how their data is being used? Because there's a big sort of generational split and divide among people in terms of what their expectations are from companies that are handling their information. So I think people that are a little bit younger and what we might call millennials, they almost have an expectation that the business is going to cater to them specifically and directly, and that they're almost more comfortable in knowing that their choices are going to be recognized and be presented to them before they even know that they want these choices given to them.
What is the current state of the law today for consumer purchases? I mean, because again, I don't, a corporate attorney could probably say, hey, we've got them published on our website. You burrow down.
Sure.
Here's our privacy policy.
Yeah.
But when I walk into you mentioned Target. I walk into a Target, I scan my card, I buy a consumer product today, a product that costs $15.
Yeah.
Is that public information that can be shared with anybody?
The current state of the law is you can't be deceptive and you can't be misleading. And that's enforced by the Federal Trade Commission in terms of, the consumer activity. So at the state level, there really isn't, the deceptive, misleading and deceptive trade practices in terms of the representations you're making to consumers about what you do with their data. And primarily the Federal Trade Commission has been the predominant body in regulating how this information is being handled and processed in terms of what's being represented. Now, many of the states have within their consumer protection statutes a similar concept of misleading and unfair deceptive trade practices. So that's the primary enforcement mechanism when a consumer has provided their data and they find out later that the data has been used in a way that they either did not anticipate or were misled about.
Well, again, let me get back to what FCC's rules or regulations are. I mean, I'm trying to burrow down to the very specific question.
Yeah.
Help us here.
Sure.
If I were to go buy this is not the Judiciary Committee where we talk about sensitive subjects very much.
Sure.
So I'll tee a sensitive subject up maybe for a laugh. I mean, you can imagine some consumer products that might be quite sensitive. You could have a constituent that says, I'm going to go, a 35-year-old dad could decide, I'm going to go downtown to the Rite Aid, and I'm going to buy a 12-pack of condoms because that's going to be our birth control method of choice. Is that something that can be done? I mean, can someone pay for the fact? Show me all the people that have bought condoms over the last 2 years. Is that publicly knowable? I mean, I know you talked about nothing deceptive, but in the current state of the law and the current state of policy by FCC rules, and the current state of privacy for most large retail organizations, is that something that I, as another business, can buy and find out? And if I can know it as another business, why can I not share that?
The answer is yes. I mean, and that's frequently happening, within the economy all the time. And companies, are chartered, developed, and are operated solely for the purposes of obtaining that type of information and selling it to others. And there has been a lot of attention in congressional hearings at the federal level about information brokers in that industry. And there is some sensitivity around that particular way information is exchanged. But in terms of, if you haven't made a representation about what's happening to your data and not complying with it, there really isn't, from a consumer protection standpoint, a mechanism for you to get any kind of relief around that, if you even know about it.
So if I've got a 35-year-old gentleman in my community that's running for city council in one of my cities, and his political opponent's savvy enough, again, I'm going to use this, again, for people in the public who are watching this, I'm going to use this extreme example for purposes of making a really kind of a disturbing point.
Yeah.
Could a political opponent go get this information and say, you know, John Smith's, who's running for city council, his choice of contraception is this. He buys this. I mean, it sounds outrageous to think about.
Right.
And thankfully, we're not there as a culture today. It's not being done every day. But is that information completely available that I could figure out what his consumer purchases are and just publicize? Could that be Facebook fodder that so and so bought a pack of condoms the other week? Let's ask his mistress if that's I mean, to me, in a world that information is completely available, is there not potential for that kind of, again, forgive my raucous creativity thinking about this, is there not potential for some real raucous and unseemly public disclosure of things?
I think the answer is there certainly is. I think there's certainly a risk of that, for sure. And I think if you contrast the way that the Europeans kind of consider data privacy as like a fundamental right, the way that they've addressed sort of all these issues, it's because they have a very ugly history of how that information was abused. And we don't have something similar in the US, but you can very easily see the slippery slope where that information is being collected. It's totally available, or it can be available unlawfully by somebody that wants to get it, and it can be abused. So I think it's a big concern for sure.
And I raise that because I want to be sensitive as we move towards the efficiency of electronic transactions. Are we putting people in a place, if you buy some certain categories of consumer goods, do you need to use cash? If Representative Dreyer, who I'd love to see move on to higher office someday, does he need to buy certain things with cash? I mean, and I say that.
Right. Yeah.
I say all that. It's great to make jokes at the expense of our freshman members, but with in all seriousness, I mean, are we in a place where we're driving people to certain consumer decisions because of information being open?
I mean, I will say that companies are very sensitive about the data they collect on individuals specifically and personally identifiable information. And in the instances where I've had clients that have been approached because the data they're collecting is valuable, or like Trevor said, they want to monetize it, they're very careful about how that information's being, what's being disclosed and to whom, and diligencing that and making sure that there's the lawful authority to make those transfers. And that often gets to, what has the consumer been told? Did they consent specifically to have it shared with a third party? Have they ever made representations about what they won't do with the data? So again, it really does get down to, what has the consumer been told?
And is a person driving down from Ontario on their way to Florida scanning their debit card in a consumer purchase in Georgia? Mm-hmm. Is it a reasonable expectation to say, oh well, our under Georgia law, our privacy policies say X, and it was your duty as a citizen of Ontario, as you drove through Georgia, to understand our privacy laws, consider them, read all 17 pages of them carefully before you scanned your debit card for consumer purchase at the Rite Aid on Wade Green Road in Cobb County? Is that an expectation that we can expect every consumer to kind of think through, understand, and be a part of? Or is there a structure that ought to be more protective than what sounds like the current state of the law is? You can buy and trade that information with anybody who wants to know.
Well, I'll just add something. It doesn't necessarily necessitate someone swiping a credit card in order for that data to be gathered. One of the points that I made earlier was using facial recognition technology. They can match that up to a cash purchase to identify the individual. Now, they won't be able to tell from a facial recognition today who that person is, but they could recognize that person the next time they're in the store. So maybe offer them a discount on another purchase. There is a consumer benefit to that information because the stores can understand buying patterns and what's selling, what's not, who's buying it, and target products and services that we want and we need. And it could be advantageous to us to walk into a store and I'm not getting discounts on diapers because I don't have kids that age, but for someone else it may be an advantage, and I would prefer not to get discounts on diapers because I'm not buying them. But if it's a whiskey product, maybe perhaps that's something that would interest me. So there is a consumer benefit to having that information as well, and that's always the dilemma when it comes to this type of transaction, is balancing off the rights of privacy with the needs for commerce and to provide better goods and services to consumers.
Yes. Well, I have sufficiently incited some questions here. That was my goal. Representative Braddock. Rakestraw, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. These long-standing privacy issues go back, and I was involved in them back in the day, with the Direct Marketing Association, and I think what they came to was a self-governance model where they wanted to put forward their own self-governments, and they set the standard of, here's what you can expect, but the world has changed, and you do have a lot of responsible companies handling this data and just using it for cross-marketing and upselling purposes, which is, become standard business practice. I think where the concern is where we get into, cybersecurity issues and theft of data, and to where, people have the ability to tap in and steal people's data and all this information they're collecting. I am rather alarmed that they can tell when someone's pregnant before they even know it themselves. That's pretty amazing. But I do think this is something that, is going to get to be a bigger, more pervasive issue as we have more face recognition and at the retail, brick and mortar point of sale. What ideas do you have for that? And then the other question I have is, my congressman actually has a bill where, businesses that are victims of a cyber attack don't really have any recourse to go after those companies that are attacking them, in a cyber way. And I think he equated it to, to our gun laws where, you can be attacked, but you don't really have any recourse to protect. And so how would, any ideas tie into that? Because to me, that's really where you're getting into more of the problem, and not necessarily collecting the data if you're being responsible, but what is a consumer resource and a company's ability to go after that? And so, what do you guys have in mind for trying to solve this pretty complex problem?
Sure.
Let me just start off and say I think you hit the nail on the head, and that is the rates of technology change has continued to accelerate, and our understanding of the implications of that and our ability to govern things like information privacy has lagged technology for about a decade. So we're about 10 years behind where technology is today, and the rate of technology again is accelerating, so we continue to fall behind. But some of these questions, this is all brand new stuff. The fitness trackers, that technology has only been out for maybe 5 years in mainstream. No one really understands the implications of that. Those fitness trackers are extremely sensitive and are picking up information, GPS information. They know where you've been, how long you've been there. There's some scary cases out there about how that information has been used. For example, telling that a person's spouse was visiting someone else for a period of time, and it was all done through fitness trackers. But the point is that, we're at a point where our understanding of these issues and our ability to adapt laws and rights associated with data privacy are lagging way behind. I think the other question that you had as far as what consumers we can do, I think David and I have some recommendations on that towards the end of the presentation.
Well, consumers and businesses, because there's two victims when a breach occurs.
Right.
There's the company that's been attacked, that was, collecting and probably handling the data responsibly for business purposes, and then there's the consumers that are also, the end victims of those.
There are two pieces of legislation that I think it would be very valuable for you all to when you have some time to take a look at. I want to give you the citations. One of them is the New York State Department of Financial Services cybersecurity requirement. It's 23 NYCRR 500. 23 NYCRR 500. The other is the Massachusetts legislation regulation 201 CMR 1700. And those are the standards for protection of personal information for the residents of the Commonwealth. Without getting into the ton of the details, or I can, I'll tell you that I think it's very worthwhile to see how those states have structured the protection of personal data and the requirements they've placed on businesses that are handling this information. Because although the technology is changing, and it's very difficult in some instances to stay ahead of the attackers, and Trevor will talk more about this, there are some sort of basic things that companies should be doing that are dealing with this kind of data. And just by way of an example, you could imagine, a quarterly or risk assessment, or once a year risk assessment of what are the vulnerabilities that exist within our business and where are the gaps in terms of our security. What are we doing to improve those and hardening our systems that are storing customer data? So in these two states, those obligations are codified, they're required. In New York, in the financial services industry, banking, insurance, anybody that's a licensed entity under those laws in New York, they have a certification requirement, a compliance obligation, an audit obligation. So that puts the burden directly back on these companies to make sure that they're doing something that can be explained and demonstrated to all of the individuals for which they're ultimately accountable, that they've taken some measures to protect this information. And they spent some time thinking about that legislative framework, and it's one that I think could be applied probably in a lot of different ways.
So let me segue into the next section. David had some more information on data
I'm
privacy.
sorry, I do have one more question. I want to pause right there if I could. Chair recognizes Representative Turner for a question.
Thank you. In the chairman's example earlier, he was talking about you need to buy cash in order to because you don't want somebody to know where you've been, kind of thing. One of the things I wanted to highlight is this concept of geofencing as well, and how it could be creatively used to tailor marketing to you. An example, there's an app that I use because it was developed by a friend of mine that sends survey questions, but it also tracks your movements. You mentioned earlier that type of data can't be used deceptively or in a misleading fashion. And my question is, what rises to the level of deceptive or misleading?
Yeah.
When I download the app, and by
Right.
the very nature of me using it, am I agreeing to terms? Have I really been informed if it's
Right.
in some really fine print in a document that I didn't really truly read, that I just checked a box so I can make sure I can use it?
Yeah. So for examples like tracking, right, geolocation, Illinois just went through a legislative session where the governor actually vetoed this bill, where it would have required express affirmative consent. So you have to sign on that you're willing to accept that you'll be tracked and that will be collected. So that was ultimately vetoed. But the Federal Trade Commission at the federal level has said that if you're going to be collecting geolocation data, and there hasn't been a federal law that's been passed, this is just more in the context of what are you disclosing to the consumer, that you should be obtaining express affirmative consent. You should be giving notice and getting that consent for that kind of tracking. So I anticipate really, and probably in the next year, as legislators come back, that we'll probably see more of geolocation-specific bills, because that does sort of get into the core of, I'm minding my own business and I happen to drive past a trigger and all of a sudden I'm bombarded with an ad or someone, so I share that concern.
I'll put it into, for the politicians in the room, I'll put it into a different scenario, right? Geofencing is, for those who don't know, your phone would be the most likely culprit. You download an app and you don't realize that it's tracking your movements. And so once you hit a predefined area called geofence, it will interact with you. And so for example, if you're walking into a Walmart and you've told it that you like a certain brand of paper towels, it'll remind you to buy that brand of paper towels as you're walking into the Walmart. In politics, it could be that a voter is walking into a polling place and they get a last minute Chairman Setzler kills kittens message right as they walk in, even if it's untrue. I don't believe that to be true for the record.
We got an alcoholic here.
You know? But the last thing the voter will see is they drive into the polling place. In our voting laws say that you cannot, you can't campaign within 300 feet or 150 feet. But 150 feet it's not even the parking lot. So you can geofence using this technology that they receive as soon as they drive onto the road. And the last thing they think about a political candidate right as they walk in the door is this message that was pumped to them from an app that they downloaded that didn't know that they were tracking, and they don't even realize why they got it. They just know that they got this really bad message, this really negative campaign. I mean, and that'll be the last thing that they think of as they walk in the polling place. So that's a concern for me, I guess, is how do we rise to the level of, do people realize, do they really realize when they're checking the box
I think the answer is most people don't read it at all. They're not paying attention to
Right.
it, and they don't care. And I mean, for the 19-year-old that's going to Coachella, right? They're at the music festival or Burning Man or wherever. They want to know in their app where every venue is. They want to know which friends were there and when. They want to know how they can get there, when the discount's coming on the T-shirt. So there are plenty of people and there are plenty of developers within the stream of commerce that are actively working to try and bring these applications to consumers, because that's what what they want. So when we start talking about the protection piece and what we perceive as maybe encroaching on privacy, there's definitely a demographic and population shift that wants that. And so they're on the economy, and as it's developing, there are people that are trying to cater that. So the impact could be quite negative in terms of economic growth and development in some instances, depending on how it's written, how it's drafted. So that's the other side of the coin. So it's challenging, very challenging.
So in that instance, I mean, would it not work to do something like, rather than a disclosure and disclaimer that nobody's going to read, because usually when they're signing up for an app, they have a purpose and they're in a hurry,
Right.
to serve that particular purpose without reading all the
Right.
long-term repercussions. But I mean, in that instance, it seems like you could limit it to utilization for push marketing versus pull marketing,
Right.
and and limit their ability to do push marketing with geo data. However, you've still got the upselling and cross-selling of
Right.
other data. So you get into a lot of fine distinctions of the way the data is managed and used, and it's a definitely a complex issue. So
Yeah.
what solutions do y'all have?
Well, I mean,
at this
and to
point?
your point, I mean, is this really even a consumer question? I mean, so consumers want what they want, and businesses want to be able to provide that to them. But maybe the focus should be, once you have that data, what are you doing to protect it? And maybe that's where the focus needs to be. And it would seem to me that a business that's making an awful lot of money in terms of obtaining this information should expend the same amount of resources to be willing to protect that information. So I think there's that might be where the solutions may be easier to find.
Okay.
That's actually a good
Please.
segue into the next section on.
I have one last question
Sure,
that
sure.
well, let's move on. I wanted to exhaust. If you have any questions at this point, push your button now. I'll recognize, and then we'll let Mr. Horwitz move on. Chair recognizes Representative Gilligan for a question.
Yeah, only because we were talking about the geolocation and the permissions that I'm accepting. As you know, more and more of us parents give these wonderful little devices to our children. You even mentioned about the toys, recording my baby's voice. That disturbs me to think about using that. So a child legally cannot enter into a contract. So what is being done to protect children? And is that something that we were going to get to later, or is that something that we should approach now?
When you say later, do you mean in terms of the presentation? Or,
Yeah, in terms of what you have
Yeah.
prepared for us in the presentation. I did not know contractually children, and I know they want to get on Facebook, so suddenly my 12-year-old is 18. I get it. Yeah.
There is a federal statute called COPPA, C-O-P-P-A, that protects children that are under the age of 13 and companies from obtaining the information without parental consent. And that legislation has come up in all kinds of contexts. Specifically recently with the Department of Education and testing, allowing children to be able to opt out of standardized federal testing, and there was an argument made that forcing children to take these tests violated COPPA. So it's primarily in terms of website and websites directed at children and obtaining data. So at the federal level, the Federal Trade Commission's been pretty serious in enforcement of companies that take children's information without parental consent. So that's a concept that's pretty well established in the law, at least at the federal level.
Yeah, in the case of most toys, the setup process would involve an adult reading terms, accepting those terms, and then once that happens, then it's a free-for-all.
And then I let the toy company have my child's voice.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Chair recognizes Representative Thomas for a question.
So as I was about to say my question, he kind of said exactly what I was going to say. Because with my 7-year-old, I actually, for her YouTube Kids, I have to sign in and do, accept. And then after that, then she starts talking to the computer. So with that, COPA wouldn't even protect.
No. Yeah.
Got it.
I mean, as the AI becomes more sophisticated, it will be able to have a full conversation, maybe obtain additional information. It'll be an interaction. So we're rapidly approaching that.
I think that, I think they might have already gotten there because she talks to it and, she'll say PBS Kids or whichever. And I guess we'll maybe segue into that, or we can talk afterwards. But I would love to know how we can maybe protect our kids from, because I've seen a couple things out there that, and it's still on YouTube. I know there's one, Freddy Fingers. I don't know if you've heard of that one, but it's like a Freddy Fingers. Everybody knows about Freddy Fingers, but it's one YouTube video that actually has Freddy Fingers shooting all the other fingers. So she'll say, I want to watch Freddy Fingers on her thing, and then it goes to the one that's shooting Mickey Mouse and shooting. So I know I've contacted YouTube about that video, but it's still on there. I know that you don't have the YouTube authority to take it off, but I know that I would like to kind of segue into that, or maybe we can talk afterwards, or how do we protect our kids from those type of videos that are still on YouTube Kids, which is only supposed to be for, supposed to be the one that is protected. YouTube Kids is supposed to be the one that's protected from everything else.
Right.
Any further questions? Hearing none, Mr. Horwitz,
Thank you.
You've got the floor again.
Thank you. So we've spoken a little bit about the collection of data, and David has touched on the data privacy. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about data breaches. So now we're looking at from the business perspective about how companies interact with their data and what their systems look like. So I'm going to put up a chart there, which is a little hard to see on the screen, but essentially you have in information security, you have concentric circles of protection. So they call this the security onion. Right in the middle of that circle, the orange dot, that represents data. And then you have other mechanisms that control access to that information. So the first logical control is logical access control. So that would be something like a system that uses a type of password. Around that, you have things like the network itself, the operating system and applications. And then you have physical security around that. And then above that, you have in the outside circle, the blue circle there, you have the operation and organization, their policies and procedures. So that essentially is what they call the security onion, and just shows you this kind of the complexity of tasks associated with trying to protect data. There are numerous different things that need to happen in order to have an effective information security program. Now, when we talk about data in this context, it all looks great. Well, let's just put all this thing together. But in reality, this is what data looks like. Data is spread everywhere. And the way data is stored today, it's basically stored in a mechanism to improve efficiency in shards. So small little pieces of data. For example, let's say you had an individual transaction. You could have that data split up in 3 different pieces, and each piece of that data would be located in a completely different location, maybe even a different country. So the way that Google and Facebook and a lot of other large organizations optimize their data storage is they'll store these shards of data across international boundaries. And it's done purely from a operational efficiency perspective. There's traffic that may be moving from one part of the world to another. Something goes down, they move it to another part of the world. So it's all done to optimize data. The point of this graphic here is that you can't think of data as, well, let's just lock it down in one spot. With the advent of new technologies like mobile technologies, cloud technologies, what used to be a hard task, just protecting data in one geographic location, has now become infinitely more difficult because of how data is so pervasive and where data is stored. And each one of those little circles there, each one of these little boxes represents a potential a target for a hacker. The fact that it looks like a target is not intentional, but that's really how difficult it is to become, how difficult it has become to protect information because of how pervasive it is and where it's stored. This next chart here really talks about what does a cyber attack look like, and this is just some basic information so you can sort of understand the context of a cyber attack. There are, in this particular diagram, there are 3 different phases. The first phase is the research, and this is where hackers or malicious nation states will go about and will start to probe systems and look for vulnerabilities. And this is a task that they do on an ongoing basis. This is not something that, well, we're just going to do this today, tomorrow. There are systems, both automated and manual systems, that are running constantly to try and detect whether there are weaknesses. Every year, for probably the last 2 or 3 decades, there is a project that was initiated to see how long it would take for someone to attack a vulnerable computer. So they take a computer that has known vulnerabilities on it, they plug it into the internet, and they time how long it takes. Well, the time that it took a decade ago and the time it takes today is completely 180 degrees. It would have taken maybe 10 years ago a day to hack that system, and today it's literally seconds. And this is because hackers are constantly bombarding computer systems and scanning the internet looking for vulnerabilities. And they're looking for things they don't even know what they're looking for. So that's one type of hacker that are just basically going out there with kind of a shotgun approach. And then, of course, you have other hackers that are much more sophisticated and that will target an individual company and with a sniper rifle. And they're going after that individual company, and they will do research. They will be well funded, and they will go after that company to try and find those vulnerabilities. And the way that they'll do those vulnerabilities is through both a technical and non-technical means. So on a technical level, they may try and find a weakness in their infrastructure. It could be a system that's unpatched. It could be a vulnerability that's been exposed that no one knew about before. But it also could be something they use social engineering. Social engineering is where you convince a person that to provide you with information, potentially a user ID and a password, that they would not otherwise give up. And a typical scenario is a hacker will send information to a user and says, it looks like your user ID and password has been compromised. Please click on this link so we can reestablish your connection. And the user unwittingly clicks on the link, puts in the user ID and password, and that effectively gives that information to the hacker, and then the hacker uses that. So again, that terminology is called social engineering, and it's a favorite of hackers. It's a very low-tech and very effective way to penetrate systems. And there's been some spectacular hacks and massive data breaches that have resulted of this particular technique. Again, it doesn't take a lot of money. It doesn't take a lot of sophistication. Sometimes it takes a little bit of patience and just a little bit of research. So the little bit of research could be, I could be sending a link to you to say, hey, check out this new whiskey collection. I don't know how we got into whiskey, but it's a good analogy. And since I'm a whiskey drinker, I think I'll run with it. Click on this link because there's some great specials on whiskey. Now, that email came to me from a friend, one of my cohorts who also likes whiskey, and he sent it to me, and I was not paying attention. I would likely click on that. And what the hacker has done is potentially hacked into my friend's email, seen that he corresponds with me on a regular basis about whiskey, put in an attachment, sent it to me, spoofed his email address to make it look like it came from him. I click on that link and potentially expose my system and my data to that hacker. And there's a terminology for that, which is called phishing. And when you do a targeted phishing attack, it's called a spear phishing. And those are the type of attacks, social engineering attacks, obviously, that are extremely dangerous and relatively easy to pull off.
Mr. Katz, did you have a...
Yeah, I wanted to, we've had some cases recently involving the exact factual scenarios that Trevor's describing, and I think it's worthwhile for you to hear just a little bit of the detail in terms of what happened and what we've been hearing from other folks that are handling these cases. The thing that's most disturbing about the email phishing campaigns where people are being triggered to put in their credentials is it gives those attackers full access to email mailboxes. And I'm not just talking about the inbox. This is the full scope of the email mailbox. So any email you've ever sent, received, stored in your folders, if you're not destroying them. And that's another thing that we can get into, records management and how that could help. But in these particular cases, the attackers were going in and setting the emails to forward automatically, unbeknownst to the user, to an unknown Gmail account. So when you start thinking about the businesses that are maintaining the most sensitive amount of data, that they've been compromised, and then those emails for the users are being forwarded, the attacker is in the system and watching the emails that are coming in, and they can set rules to make sure that the users never have any idea of what's happening. So they don't get to the deleted box, they don't get to the dissent box, and these attackers are getting in the middle of financial transactions, creating fraudulent wire instructions and real estate examples, closings, and they are getting the individuals to wire money after having created the fraudulent transaction. Now, what's really difficult about these cases is that imagine your email inbox undeleted for all time. Your obligation in most of these states is to go in and determine whether personally identifiable information existed in those emails, and the standards in states are accessed and acquired. So, but there are 4 states that are access alone. So if the attacker is in the email mailbox, that brings every one of these emails into scope in terms of being reviewed to determine what data was in there and potentially having to notify these individuals if the information did contain personally identifiable information. So the effect of this, at least in phishing, can be substantial. And the cure in many of these cases is both technical. There's controls that exist for the email servers and Office 365 and those things. But also, if every individual understood that when you look to go to your email, you have to really scrutinize where it came from, what kind of link is in there, does it seem suspicious, and that kind of mandatory training in a business, the beating the drum on those kinds of issues could really save a lot of pain. And I was told last week that the Federal Reserve actually has a 3-strike and you're out policy. If you click on, and there are many companies that exist, Fish Labs is one in Charleston, South Carolina, that will create an employee packaging training that will send your employees fake emails and that will gauge how susceptible the employee population is to actually clicking on them. The Federal Reserve, if you've done that 3 times, no matter who you are, you're fired. So that's an immediate, I think, fix that would get a lot of attention if employers were forced, by the legislature or whomever, to train their employees to say, hey, this is what a spoofed email could look like. These are the ways that attackers are coming in and making, getting folks to click on these. That could have a tremendous impact and sort of on these types of issues, I think.
I actually heard from somebody this week at Wellstar that said when she was a new employee, they did that and she failed the test. And so they apparently have that as part of their
Very effective.
Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Wirtz, do you have some more things to kind of move through I do have some questions, but I'd like to hold them if you can keep moving through this for us.
Yeah, so again, in the stage 2 of an attack, again, there's 2 primary mechanisms that are used. There's a technical and non-technical. So the other piece is the technical piece. And the technical piece is extremely complicated as well. All the different components of your infrastructure have weaknesses in them. The databases have weaknesses, operating systems, firewalls, routers. There's multiple different layers of complexity in information systems. And a weakness in any one of those layers could result in a data breach. So it's a constant challenge for people in the information security to keep up with those sort of challenges. And there are products that are produced today that have vulnerabilities and no one knows about them. You know, there was a Microsoft vulnerability that was recently discovered, and it had been around undetected for more than 10 years. And it was something huge. It was a massive hole. Now Microsoft picked it up and they were able to patch it, but 10 years that just lay there. And there's also no way to tell how many people actually had used that exploit, for example, a hacker or a nation state, and went undetected. Our own government uses some of these techniques for us to hack into our enemies. The NSA has got a program in place, and constantly does this on a regular basis to find vulnerabilities in systems. You've seen things like Stuxnet, which was an attack on the Iranian nuclear power plant. They had used 2 what they call zero-day vulnerabilities. A zero-day vulnerability is something, again, that's never been detected out in the wild. To find one of them is extremely rare. To use 2 of them, that takes an extraordinary amount of resources to do. But those are the type of things that hackers and nation states also have access to in terms of their hacking activity.
Explain zero-day vulnerability again. I missed that term. Forgive me.
A zero-day vulnerability is a vulnerability that's never been detected out in the wild. So it means we found it today, day 0. And the reason why that is powerful is because knowledge of that vulnerability is not known. So if there is a known vulnerability, then the developer or the manufacturer of that particular software or that particular hardware device has the ability to create a patch, a fix, and publish that and give people time to go and apply a patch and apply that fix to that system, and to prevent someone from using that vulnerability on their particular system. So the timeline between 0 day, the day that the attack or the vulnerability was detected, and the time that you patch the systems is the period of time that you're vulnerable. And the shorter that period of time, obviously the better protected the company is. So in most instances, when a 0 day is found out in the wild, the company is informed relatively quickly. But if they're not on top of things and that vulnerability lasts there, hackers will take advantage of it. The reason why this is kind of pertinent also to the conversation is because that's exactly the type of thing that happened, at least being publicly reported on the Equifax hack. So Equifax had an Apache server, and again, this is all what I'm reading. I'm reading on blogs and on the media. So I have no personal knowledge of anything to do with that instance. But to my knowledge, the hackers had taken advantage of a vulnerability that had been detected in an Apache server that was used at Equifax, and the hackers took advantage of that. The system itself hadn't been patched. The information that I've read online says that the other systems within Equifax were actually patched, but this particular system was left unpatched for some reason. Could have been human error or a systematic failure in detecting that. And hackers took advantage of that, penetrated into the system, and were able to exfiltrate all of that data.
You should explain patching.
So patching is just a fix. So software is constantly updated. Probably every couple of weeks you boot up your laptop, it says there, would you like to download the patches? Some of it's done automated in the background if you've opted for that. But all software has patches that will periodically be distributed. Some of them are upgrades. Maybe they're changing the color, changing a logo, and others are actually fixing things that are broken. File connection doesn't work, and more often than not, they're security fixes.
Okay. Mr. Horwitz, anything further in terms of presentation? Or
So let me just talk a little bit about the third element here, which is the exfiltration, which is kind of important when it comes to understanding a cybersecurity breach. Exfiltration of the data is how the hackers actually take advantage and use that data. So these are the sort of three different phases of it. But you can't minimize the last phase, because in a well-protected computer system, you should have the ability to detect when data is leaving your system. And so you have the ability to, to protect your front end from attack, and also what's leaving your system. You've seen, again, reported in the media about different type of scenarios. Most large companies now monitor what's leaving their network and can detect when large amounts of data are using. But hackers can also take advantage of circumstances. A couple years ago, there was a huge known attack on Target, where, and I'll bring that as a sort of case study because it touches on a couple of these different points. The hackers are reported to have sent a phishing email to a vendor of Target. The vendor happened to be a heating and air conditioning vendor. What their business was is kind of irrelevant, but they had access into a system inside Target for essentially providing them with invoices. So the hacker phished one of the employees at this heating and air conditioning company and obtained the credentials to this back-end system. Once they took those credentials, they got into Target and then tunneled their way through multiple different levels until they got to their point of sale system. They installed some malware on the point of sale system so that every time someone swiped a card, that data would actually go into a database that the hacker would have access to. And the hackers timed they did this for months, and they went undetected for many months and accumulated a huge amount of sensitive information, payment card information, which again could be monetized. And once they had that all the information, they waited until the opportune moment in order to get the information out. And what they did is they chose Thanksgiving weekend. And on Thanksgiving weekend, when you would expect a store like Target to have huge amounts of data being transferred up and down, the hackers took that, pressed the button, and exported all of the data and downloaded it to their systems. That activity was actually detected by Target. But because of the expected traffic patterns over that weekend, the security team thought that this was regular data and marked it as a acceptable anomaly and went on their business. But it just shows you, and the point was to try and understand the sophistication of these hackers and how they've taken advantage of all this multiple different layers and the complexity in these systems. There are essentially three different buckets of how you can prevent a data breach. The first one comes down to managing your data. So you can encrypt your data, you can monitor and restrict access to the data transfers. You can actually reduce data retention, which is something that David touched on earlier, and we can talk about in terms of some of the recommendations we have as well, reducing data retention. You can also transfer data in a secure fashion, so making sure that not only it's secured at rest when it's stored in data systems, but also when it's being transferred across open and public networks. The second thing is to protect systems. So you have logical access controls, you have identity management, you have the ability to define who has access to your system, and then the ability to both identify and patch vulnerabilities. You need the ability also to audit and test your defenses on a regular basis, and you also need to manage your third-party risk. So again, the example that I gave earlier about Target, this was a vendor of theirs. They had no idea that a vendor, a trusted partner, could actually be a vector into their systems, but that's exactly what happened. And the third component of how to prevent breaches, and again, this slide is completely summarized. I'm trying to summarize a whole industry, but this is talking about people. So hiring the right resources and having those resources and those people you hire follow correct procedures, training end users, and then responding to incursions quickly. It's become an accepted understanding within the cybersecurity industry that incident response is a critical skill to have, and that means the ability to respond when you've been hacked. It's kind of the what is the game plan in the event of the point where you've actually been hacked. And it's just become an understanding in the industry that at some point you will have an incident, a small incident perhaps, or a large incident. But information security teams train for how to handle incidents because of how difficult it is to protect their systems. We've got a couple of recommendations here, which David and I can talk about, or we're happy to answer questions on some of the other things about preventing data breaches or any other topics that you have before we get into the recommendations.
I'd also like to, Mr. Chairman,
Sure.
just to add on to the legal portion of this, I'd like to just run you very quickly through what other states are doing with their state data breach notification rules, and also point out some of the things that Georgia's doing. So there are 32 states where the definition of PII is broader than the general definition. The general definition of PII is first and last name in combination with a social security number, driver's license number, state ID, or a combination of account number, credit card, debit card with a security code, access code, and password that would permit access to your accounts. So there are 32 states with that traditional definition. There are some states that expand that list of data elements to include email address and username and password, automated license plate reader, date of birth, medical or health information. Georgia uses the traditional definition of PII. There are 4 states that trigger notification obligations by access alone. There doesn't have to be any evidence that it's been acquired. Georgia's an acquisition state. There are 4 states that have access alone: Connecticut, Florida, New Jersey, and Puerto Rico. There are 30 states that require a risk of harm analysis, which means that you have to actually be able to demonstrate.
Mr. Katz?
Yes.
I love this. This is great stuff.
Yeah.
Could you kind of walk through this more
Yeah,
slowly?
I think you all need to take a look at 10.1.9.12 and 10.1.9.11. I think they need to be updated. The definition under Georgia law for information broker would seem to exclude other companies from maybe even having to make a notification. In Georgia, there's no obligation to notify the state AG. I think that's something that ought to be in the statute. I think the statute needs to be modernized and made more consistent with how other states are handling it. There's no specific time frame. Florida is now 30 days. Most states with requirements are 45 days.
Okay, so kind of stepping through this deliberately. So the question was, I'm just trying to define the issues here. The definition of personally identifying information. There's a conventional definition.
Yeah.
In 32 states. There's a sort of a tailored definition in the others, I presume.
Yes.
And then you said Florida and 3 others has the most rigorous definition? Or is
So Florida is one of the states where there doesn't necessarily have to be acquisition.
Okay, so let's get to that question.
Yeah.
So there's the definition of PII. That's kind of one question.
Yeah.
The second question is the notification requirement based on acquisition or access, right?
Correct. What triggers the obligation to notify the individual that there's been an issue?
So access, or the other characteristic is what?
Acquisition.
Acquisition. And you said something else.
Some of the states have a risk of harm analysis.
Okay.
So, can there be a determination that the information that was accessed or acquired reasonably leads, to harm? And I've never had anyone suggest that they shouldn't notify based on that standard.
Sure.
Yeah.
What's the most rigorous structure in this country with respect to if there is access, there is a considerable risk of harm, and perhaps we can postpone this as a question I asked you as we were talking about it earlier.
Yeah.
The idea of a duty to demonstrate harm. If my data is breached, let's say there is even acquisition, I can demonstrate acquisition.
Yeah.
They can hold this information for years before they actually exploit it. Maybe
Right.
not a credit card, but other things. My ability to experience harm in 2023 for a breach that may have happened. There was sort of a breach in 2011 that happened with my healthcare system.
Right.
Now there's a breach in my financial system, and then 2023 something happens to me. First question is, how do I create this clear, definable trail of breadcrumbs that leads from a exploitation of my personal information in 2023 back to 2011 versus 2017? What is the duty of a member of the public to kind of make that link and prove that with respect to damage?
So for many of these class action lawsuits that have been brought by plaintiffs and consumers over the last few years, the real challenge they had was proving that they were damaged, right? Because your information's compromised, but unless you can show that the attacker's been used it or you've been harmed, you can't really bring a case. But now I think we're getting to the point where, maybe you can't prove damages, but how could you ever prove causation? Because there have been so many breaches. How could you ever demonstrate that this particular plaintiff was the cause of the harm? So I think that's going to be a very big challenge for consumers to be able to prove causation given the environment and given what we know without, being able to fundamentally tie it back to one particular. And now in light of Equifax, I mean, that's information that's been pulled from many, many people that have submitted it their businesses.
And again, to the extent it's difficult for consumers, members of the public to prove causation, that could have the effect of really lowering the duty of somebody who's protecting data. They say, well, you know what, we may lose it. I'm just thinking, if you're making decisions about protecting data,
Yeah.
it could have the effect of in terms of what kind of forces does it move someone towards more caution versus less caution. It could actually have the interesting effect of convincing businesses, well, you know what, if we're breached and data's collected, there's been so many breaches that his information's been collected so many times, so many breaches, he'll never be able to prove causation to me.
Mm-hmm.
So it really almost undermines the incentives for good behavior.
Yeah.
Because it's not provable. So to me,
yeah, I think to some extent that's true, but I also think that sort of what's also evident in terms of the Equifax breach is I think there's considerable brand damage that's done to companies, and I think consumers may be at a tipping point where they may not be willing to trust companies that don't at least outwardly explain to them the measures they're taking to preserve data or to protect data. So while maybe someone could selfishly make the assumption that this really isn't going to hurt us, we don't have anything to do, I think from a brand perspective and a market perspective, it could certainly have a long-term impact. So I think there could be a counterbalance to that if someone's actually thinking that way in terms of their liability.
Let me just add something to just take off from what David said, and this is a kind of a critical point. The vast amount of personally identifiable information that is collected is not information that the individual may have consented to have collected. And in the case of Equifax, I as a consumer have never done business with Equifax, but they have collected this information. We do not have a direct relationship. So in that case, David mentioned the point about brand damage. If my information at my bank got compromised, I can decide to go to another bank. But the fact that Equifax
or credit union,
the fact that Equifax was hacked, it has no impact on me because I have no relationship with them. So that is kind of one of the dilemmas of the whole information privacy debate is how do you protect information when you do not even have a relationship with an entity that holds data about you?
That's precisely where I was going with my questions.
Mm-hmm.
Is that I don't know that it's really a choice. This data's kind of washing around. I mean, at what level do I have a duty? If I do business with one company, at what level do I have? Before I do business with company A, who shares with company B, C, and D, or has a financial relationship, that down the sort of this whole stream of connections, what ability, what duty do I have to understand all the range of businesses with whom they're doing business and their procedures and so forth, which kind of gets me back to this sort of do consumers have to prove damage and harm? What level are we, or are we moving towards a day in which there's almost a kind of a violation is a per se tort, that you have this and there's some damage that's tied to that. I mean, I don't know how else do you create a circumstance where individual consumers, I mean, how many class action cases does it need? I don't know that the marketplace is ever going to correct itself that way without a legal structure that recognizes sort of this legal fiction that I can prove damage and causality and be able to sort of bring this whole series of cases to somebody. How does that ever really get fixed? I don't know there's ever really a meaningful remedy there. So, because the people with whom I'm doing business, maybe I have some ability to control that, but there's people that have my data with whom I never did business and never entered into a meaningful relationship with, to your point.
Yep.
So, that being said, Representative Scott, did you have a question?
Okay, yes. I guess I'm on the same line with you. I could say that, and I'm trying to figure it out. I would say, a situation happened with,
someone that I know dearly with DirecTV, and their information was given to a company in which DirecTV had told them, oh, you're going to have someone call you with special promotions. So they got a call from someone with special promotions, thought it was DirecTV, and then they end up giving in to the people. They have the information and all that. They had the DirecTV information. They had everything that they needed to have. And so the people thought it was a promotion coming from DirecTV, but in regards, it really was not. So what can those people do to try to recruit? Because after they spoke with DirecTV, they said, oh, we'll have our fraud people to investigate it. And now they're saying the fraud people investigators said, well, we don't know if they got the information from us or from Equifax. And, you know, people just having to keep going back and forth with things like that. But really, it was all the DirecTV information that the people had. And, you know, they was telling me, you know, they have the same music, the same setup as DirecTV, so they didn't know the difference. So what is a person to do in situations like that when we talk about compromising people's data? And, you know, right now everybody want to roll it back to Equifax. So, you know, so where do people go from here?
We do have some kind of recommendations when it comes to consumers, and it's worthwhile just spending a little bit of time and talking about, you know, what are the recommendations. I can go through them, each one of them, but before we even get there, we have to recognize that within the context, again, the vast majority of consumers are not individual targets for hackers. It's very inefficient from a hacking standpoint to go and try and hack one individual. Because what can I do with one? If I get your social security number individual basis, I can only monetize that once. You know, people are targeting businesses that have volumes of data. So there are things you can do to protect yourself, to lower to reduce your footprint. But the reality is it's up to corporations and large businesses and governments and other people that have access to large sources of information that will continue to be the targets of hackers. You know, the instances of individuals being hacked for their own personal information are extremely rare. And they're mostly done in maybe an espionage fashion or sabotage, industrial espionage, but it's only or like for to somehow influence that person. But they're very rare when someone's going to hack information on a consumer and actually use it maliciously. But some of the things that consumers can obviously do is, the first thing is to learn about cybersecurity practices, how to maintain security and be more educated. The second thing is they can stop reusing passwords. How many people here, and I'm not asking you to raise your hands because I don't want to embarrass anyone, reuse passwords on multiple different sites or multiple different locations? You know, just consider this for a minute. If one of those accounts get hacked, essentially the first thing the hackers are going to do is try and reuse those same credentials against every other site that they can think of. So if your email gets hacked, they're going to try to go into your bank account, into your social media feeds, everything. They're going to try and use that same credentials. So stop reusing passwords, change your passwords. You should have a different password essentially for every different application. Which brings up another problem, is how do you store all those passwords? So you need a mechanism to store that. There are tools available that can do that. You can have downloaded onto your phone, onto a laptop that has the ability to securely store passwords. So there is a solution to that, and that's a better option than putting them out there and having all of those passwords the same. Change your passwords periodically. Most consumer interactions, like your banking sites and things, do not force you to change passwords, because the last thing they want to do is get calls from you to say, I don't remember my password because it expired. it becomes a cost to those businesses, and they don't want to incur that cost, so they do not expire passwords. In the corporate world, because they have a higher threshold for security, it's very common to expire passwords, and industry standards call for an expiration of passwords. Typically, it's in the region of anywhere from 45 to 90 days is a typical scenario of how frequently you need to change your password. So again, that's something that consumers can do. And then the other thing is just reduce your data footprint. It's always amazes me if you go out there and you do research on someone, how much information is out there. And, some of the information we want to share, special events. I want to share that it's my birthday coming up in a couple of weeks' time, but that information, if someone gets it, it can be used against me for identity theft. So anytime you can reduce your footprint will be advantageous. And the most, the most obvious thing of all of this is for consumers to monitor accounts and their credit reports, and for evidence of their data being breached or used against them. There are good laws in place that make the likelihood of individuals being personally liable for transactions, and that reduce the liability. To my knowledge, and again, I'm not an expert, David is, there is a federal law that says if your credit card information is used without authorization, your personal liability is $50 in total. Right. So regardless of the amount of fraud that occurred. But in practice, most credit card companies will not even charge you that $50. They will eat it, and they'll absorb the cost. And the reason is simple, is because it costs them more than $50 to acquire you as a customer. So for them to lose you as a customer and to get another customer costs them like $150, so it's just a trade-off. They'll eat the cost. And the last thing I just want to mention on this slide, and then I'll hand it over to David to add his, is to really have your own personal incident response plan. If you hear about a hack and you think you may be susceptible, go back and look at all those passwords, make sure you haven't reused it, go to the site that was hacked, change the password immediately. So you can take responsibility for your own information and respond when you see this as a data breach or data hack, and really treat your information just as you would any other asset. If you knew that there was a flood coming, move your personal goods to higher ground. It's the same thing with a data breach. If you hear about something, you have to take responsibility and to the extent that you can, protect yourself.
I want to come back to. Sorry,
Mr. Wirtz, appreciate that. I want to get really into some of these things. If your presentation's done,
we have 2 more slides on recommendations, which I'm happy to go over.
Could you guys maybe take seats next to each other, and we can talk through those that way, or do you need to flip the slide from there?
Yeah, I'll flip them.
Okay. We're going to go a little bit over 12 if it's okay with members, but I want to be sensitive to our time. I've got 22 minutes until 12, so and I know there's going to be more questions.
Okay.
Would you want to make your presentation on your recommendations now, and then we just kind of finish up with questions? We can take it that way.
I think that'll work.
Why don't you go ahead and do that for me?
Okay. So
before you do, are there any members that have to ask a question now, or can you wait? 5. Okay, great. Go ahead and wrap up your recommendations if you can.
Okay, we've got 2 more slides, and then we can do some Q&A. So when it comes to the corporate side, in terms of how we can, what sort of actions the committee could consider, and the state of Georgia can consider in terms of helping to improve cybersecurity in general and data privacy. Probably the number one thing is education and training. We have a need for children, adults across this nation to be trained on cybersecurity practices. And we need that to start as young as possible. Kids today are getting online. I have a little 10-year-old who has her own phone already. They're getting online at a younger age, and they need to understand what safe cybersecurity practices mean. And building it into the curriculum, into our elementary schools, and carrying that through. This is an essential life skill. It's essential life skill today, and it's going to continue to be important in the future. So the more education and training we can do at a younger level, the better off we're going to be as a society.
There's Ben Halpert, Halpert, Ben. Savvy Cyber Kids is a Georgia-based individual who's developed an entire program and curriculum around this.
And there are tons of sources available on how to educate yourself as far as making sure that you have safe cybersecurity practices. Corporations pay money to do this. There's security awareness training. David had mentioned these simulated phishing attacks, which are very effective to weed out individuals who need training. One of the things is when you have a system set up in an environment and you do send them a phishing attack, and the individual who clicked on that link when they shouldn't have, the first thing it does is it notifies them. It says, look, you shouldn't have clicked on that link. This could have been a phishing attack. You didn't check it carefully, and now you need to take some training. So it's like the immediate training to follow that. So that's the first thing. The second thing we would recommend is to look at establishing some sort of cybersecurity advisory board. The solution, we think, to cybersecurity issue across the nation is not government solving it on its own. If you look at our critical infrastructure, again, more than 80% of our critical infrastructure lies in the hands of the private sector, which means it's going to take a public and private sector cooperation to make things happen. So in our opinion, it would make sense to create some sort of cybersecurity advisory board in the state of Georgia and bring in professionals from every level, people like who come from the cybersecurity industry, such as myself, from the legal side and data privacy, such as people like David, as well as the businesses and clients that we serve. They're part of there are victims in a lot of these cases, and they're fighting very sophisticated adversaries. So bring them in and help them work on solving these problems. So, create programs to identify cybersecurity threats, so that we can share that information. Help protect critical infrastructure is an essential task. And there's something very interesting is being created, obviously, at the government level. The U.S. Army has the Cyber Command. So this is a unit of the military that is dedicated to protecting our critical infrastructure from a military perspective. There are, I think, 134 divisions within Cyber Command. I would see, just like we have taken and have state police and we have law enforcement within our own state, I think the trend would be to see some sort of state cyber command type of capability as well, so that we can provide a capability to the citizens of our state to protect themselves, and also to businesses to help advise them. There's a lot of resources that could be very well spent and put to use to bring together all of these resources together to make a whole cybersecurity environment more secure. The second thing, or the third thing on this slide, is to enforce information security standards. It's not rocket science, and there are companies out there that are doing a lot of really good work and spending a lot of money to protect themselves, and unfortunately, they don't get the recognition because they're not making the newspapers. There's no headlines today that said XYZ company spends 20% of their cybersecurity budgets, and look what they had never been hacked. That's not going to make the news. So the companies we're seeing are kind of the worst offenders in some respects, and the victims of these attacks. But in order to make an even playing field, we need to have information security standards that companies are held to universally. And there are no standards today. There are standards within the industry for particular types of data. There's standards for protecting healthcare information, financial information, as David mentioned, within the state of New York. And there are also industry regulations such as the payment card industry data security standard, which ensures that companies that collect payment card information need to meet a particular standard. And that program has been very effective at reducing the amount of fraud and preventing fraud from taking place. But not every company is being held accountable for standards, because some of them fall outside of those regulations. And probably the most important point that I want to make about that, we have a lot of laws and rules in place, but there's no enforcement. There's no validation. And that is probably the biggest downfall of all of these type of rules and regulations, is where is the compliance validation? For companies that are doing the right thing, that there's no validation. So you have company X who's doing the right thing, protecting data. Company Y says, you know what, we won't protect this data, but we're not going to get harmed by it because we don't have to demonstrate that we've complied with any security standards. So having that, that compliance validation to us is very important. The next point is really talking about how we interact with data. We have so much data out there, but we consider data to be an asset, but really the mindset should be this asset should be toxic. And this is also, we have to balance off the needs of business and consumers when it comes to making data toxic. And what I mean by making it toxic is making the liabilities for breaching their data so egregious that no one wants to collect it. It's the analogy would be if I would like to store nuclear material under my house in my basement. The reason I'm not going to do it is because the liabilities exceeds the advantages of doing that. So if you have a scenario where you can create rules and regulations and penalties for data breaches that are so egregious to companies that would make them double think about whether they really need to have that asset in the first place. And goes back to a point David made earlier about reducing data retention. The last point here on this slide was really just having tougher penalties for cybersecurity related crimes. We do have rules in place, but the more we can enforce them. Unfortunately, when we look at these things, a lot of the cybersecurity or the hacking that's occurring are being done by very sophisticated entities. This is not necessarily kind of a little kid in his basement who gets together with his buddies. These are nation states that are using these cyber attacks as a means to either disrupt our businesses or to cause other malicious activity. And we've seen that play out in a number of different scenarios, with North Korea attacking Sony as an example. It's widely reported that they were behind the Sony attack. And you see this playing out again and again. And it's not necessarily only doing this for political gain. You see this for economic purposes as well. Anytime that a nation state can disrupt commerce in the United States, it scores a victory for them. The analogy is for this type of attack that's going on right now is death by 1,000 cuts. We're getting consistently hacked businesses again and again and again. And they're doing it at a level where it's not rising to the level where we think, well, we need to go to war with this country. But there are little skirmishes going on right now while we're in this meeting, going on all across both Georgia and across the nation, where hackers are infiltrating systems.
I have 2 quick points.
Were those your recommendations?
Yeah.
Awesome. So if PowerPoint's done,
Yeah.
you can grab a seat next to Mr. Katz. Again, we can have my board's lit up with questions, but Mr. Katz, you got the floor.
I have 2 quick points, and I can make them in less than a minute. The first one, I want to focus you back on 10.1.912B, because we had a discussion really quickly about the vendors in the data supply chain. And right now, the only way as a data owner that you can influence what a vendor is going to do if they're breached is by contract. Because the statute only requires that vendor that's not the data owner or the licensor, that's just maintaining the data, to notify you within 24 hours. That's their only requirement. If I've given you my information as a business, you're serving me as a vendor, you're processing it, you're handling it, you're doing whatever with it, and you have a breach of my data, you have to tell me, and that's the only requirement you have, because you're not the owner. And that's how most of the statutes are written. So your only remedy is by contract. And that's if the other side is willing to agree to do all the right things. So I think that's probably something that'll change. The second point is that there's a tremendous amount that could be accomplished by requiring businesses, as a matter of law, to dispose of records. I'm not talking documents. We all have documents. I'm talking about things that are, required for the business to operate after a certain period of time becoming destroyed. And I include email in that too. Not all emails are records. Nobody uses their inbox as a record repository. So I think that's a very important thing that could be accomplished legislatively, to require businesses to manage their records responsibly, and their documents for that matter. So that's it.
We do have a lot of
I'd like to
questions.
add just one other thing, which is part of the recommendations, and I may have kind of skipped over it when I spoke about education and training. And this is something that can really benefit Georgia and the nation in general. There is a massive need right now for cybersecurity professionals. The industry statistics say that we are short currently about 200,000 cybersecurity professionals. And that number is escalated to grow globally by 2019 into the region of between 2.5 and 3 million jobs globally that will be available and underserved in the market. So we have a twofold problem. We have the problem that we're trying to protect all of these businesses and the lack of resources, but we also have a massive opportunity to create jobs. And if the United States, if we fail to fill all those positions, that means those jobs are going to go elsewhere. Even if we can find the resources outside of the US, which again is very difficult, but those resources those jobs will be going outside of our borders. So whatever we can do to create cybersecurity training and get people trained on this, cybersecurity jobs are extremely well paying. The average salary for a cybersecurity analyst, according to 2 industry sources, is between $75,000 and $85,000 a year. That is a well-paying job. And we can create jobs and serve our nation and serve the state by creating and putting more programs in place to train people on cybersecurity. So the education piece is at 2 levels. We need to train young kids and from as soon as they can walk about safe cybersecurity practices, just like we train them, to look both ways when they cross the street. We need to do that and train them all the way through elementary, into high school, into college level, and then in the corporate workforce, continue that education. And secondly, if we can create some sort of programs where we can have cybersecurity academies and put in place programs in place to educate people and get them into this profession, we'll be doing justice for this country. It will have a lasting effect for decades.
Thanks, sir. We're going to take some time. I've got 10 minutes till 12. We're going to go till 12:20. If you need to leave at 12 because you have a hard stop, you're welcome to leave. That's anybody here, any members of the committee. But I want to give time. We had budgeted 30 minutes for the committee to ask questions. I know we've asked some kind of as we've gone, so if I don't want to be in sort of this rush to 12 to an artificial deadline. I want to make sure our questions get answered. So do you guys have the ability to stay around until 12:15, 12:20?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. That said, we've got a row of lights here. Chair will recognize Representative Gilligan for a question.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chairman. So I had a couple of questions. One of them was when you were talking about the PII in the various states. And I was then curious, as a consumer residing in New York, is it my data that is protected at that level regardless of where the company is located?
Correct.
So the Georgia code is not protecting Georgia consumers to the same level that the New York code is protecting New Yorkers, or that the Florida code is.
Correct.
Okay, so it's just me, the consumer, that is at the risk, not,
Right.
I would not be risking losing corporate jobs in the state of Georgia because I would put higher standards in place.
I don't think so.
So to clear, so if, where does the law accrue? Is it because data is maintained in the cloud and
Yeah.
maybe a sort of a mixture of data centers? Does New York's law apply to people who are consumers who live and are sitting in New York? Would Georgia law apply to consumers here but not businesses here? Is there a nexus issue with respect to what a business is and where a business is? I mean, how is that defined?
Yeah, so what happens in these breaches often is the first step is we identify all the affected consumers and their state of, we identify all the affected consumers and their state of residence and follow the law from that state.
Okay.
So if you're maintaining data on New York individuals as a Georgia company, your obligation is to comply with the New York law to make sure they're notified and you're carrying out your obligations.
So if there were a company that had a data center in Georgia, a data center in Texas, and a data center in Kansas, and they're a national operation, and there were 10,000 consumers in New York State, in 48 states whose data was breached, the company, who could be headquartered in Georgia, would have to comply with New York law for the 10,000 people in New York whose data was breached. Is that how that works?
Correct, right. It would follow the individual consumer.
So it's consumer driven. So from a business standpoint, under that circumstance, a business couldn't say, well, I'm a fintech operation. I support people in 180 countries around the world in every state. If we passed a state statute, generally it would apply just to consumers in Georgia. It wouldn't apply to their consumers in other countries and other states, because those states would govern.
Correct.
So it's consumer driven, not business location headquarters driven then.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Let me just add an example of how you can actually use that sort of rules and regulations to an advantage. I read an article about the state of Nevada, and the state of Nevada instituted a program where if a company was following the payment card industry data security standard and the company got breached, that would reduce the likelihood of that company being held liable for that data breach. And that made it really a pro-business legislation, because it encouraged companies who want to reduce their potential liability to set up shop in that state. So I think that's an example of legislation that serves two purposes. One is you're enforcing a standard, which is in this particular instance the payment card industry data security standard, and which makes all businesses have to comply with that regulation within the state. And beyond that, it also makes it as business friendly because it's encouraging companies to set up shop there too. So that sort of scenario, again, levels the playing field and seems like a very well-intended legislation. I can't predict how it's going to pan out as that, flashes through the system and you see more different instances. But it seemed like a really good use of using law to protect both businesses and encourage them to do the right thing, at the same time protecting consumer information.
But then it's the consumer who would be paying for the breach through the liability.
Well, it would absolve the company essentially of saying, if you do all of these things according to the standard, you're not liable for a data breach. It was sophisticated enough to breach all of these accepted standards.
Right.
We understand that that's basically not your fault.
Okay. And then I had just a general question. A lot of my accounts, I have it set up for dual authorization. So in order for me to log on to some of my social media sites, it says, oh, okay, is it really you? And I have to send my authentication code. Is that not something that we could do as a recommendation for consumers to set up, whether it's an app that they download, or could we have corporations use this as a standard? And is that an expense, a very expensive solution to some of these potential breaches, so that nobody can apply for my credit because they would not have access necessarily to whatever device I'm using to do that second authorization?
Yeah, the technical term for what you're talking about is called multi-factor authentication.
Okay.
And the way multi-factor authentication works is you need to provide two pieces of information. And it needs to be either something you know, in this case it could be a password, something you have, in this case access to a secure code, it could be a mobile phone, or it could be a physical device that actually has a code in it, or something you are. And that something you are is like a biometric reader. So that's considered the kind of technical term around multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication is an industry best practices for certain types of access to systems. As an example, for the payment card industry, if you want remote access to a network, as an administrator, you have to have multi-factor authentication. And it raises the bar, it makes it much more difficult in the case of where someone's credentials, their authentication credentials, in other words, their user ID and their password, where that gets compromised, it creates a second mechanism that prohibits a hacker from using that information to infiltrate the system. So it is a good practice to have that. And where consumers can set that up for themselves, if the entity that they're engaging with allows them to do that, it's very effective. I do know that even within the Equifax environments and other credit agencies, you do have the ability, if you request it, I think there is a cost associated with it, but you can set up essentially a multi-factor authentication system. And essentially is that if someone wants access to your credit, you have to provide not only your social security number, but a separate PIN. And that PIN is what allows that entity access. And you can also go ahead and change that PIN periodically, which would be a good practice. In that particular circumstance, it's not a perfect system, because if you know the PIN and you haven't changed it, you can still have a compromise. But it is a multi-factor authentication in its traditional sense, where the factor is always changing, or the factor is something, again, something you have, something you know, something you are. It is a very effective mechanism for maintaining logical access control.
The New York Department of Financial Services regulation incorporates multi-factor authentication when accessing non-public personally identifiable information. So that's been put into their law in the state of New York.
Okay.
Super. Any other questions, Representative Gilligan?
No, thank you very much.
Chair recognizes the ever-patient Representative Perkle, who's been waiting to ask a question.
Oh, bless your heart. Thank you. Thank y'all for being here. I really appreciate that. In our last committee meeting, y'all were not a part of it, but we were looking at the election integrity, looking at the machines that we're using, and after the nation's leading expert essentially said the gold standard is a number 2 pencil and a piece of paper, and then we come to this presentation today is dealing with data integrity, and you make me scared to pull anything out but a $20 bill when I go to pay something, and hide my face from the cameras. And my question is this, and it deals with something that the chairman alluded to earlier. Let's say I have an eidetic memory, and I can do these tremendous passwords, and I do it regularly, every 30 days, and I do it regularly on every account that I have. And I don't open suspicious emails, and I've done everything that you've recommended, and I've done it right. But my data is still not secure. I've done every blooming thing that you can do. And I get notified that one of the big data centers has been compromised through no fault of my own. The question I have, what do you tell a consumer? How do you reassure a consumer that my most important information is secure when I've done everything right? Not saying that I have. My password's not 1, 2, 3, but I might have some going across. But what do you is something on the new Apple phone that's coming out with the facial recognition, and is that something that and that's still not going to protect me on the other end? And is this something that we're living with, the new millennium, even legislation that we might pass? You tar and feather, or you castrate, or you do whatever to the people that are taking data, and you make tremendous penalties. There are still going to be bad guys that's going to look for this information because there's a profit motive. Is this just something now that we have to get used to?
Yeah, and so just for a second, I'd like to come back to the election context, because I think there's a fundamental lack of confidence in some of these systems now, and that's just a function of the time we're in. There's real concern about just the integrity generally, and so I don't think it's unreasonable for this expert to have told you that it's time to go back to paper, right? I think that's a serious thing.
He
to
made
consider.
a great argument that that's the
people,
the right
in that
method.
In that case, the biggest risk you have is maybe somebody's not honest. But not that the entire system is imperfect and can't be protected at any cost, because the technology changes and advances changes, and you're trying to plan for the attack today. That's not going to be the attack of tomorrow. So I think the point you're making, it's very, very difficult. But a paper process maybe has just more integrity. So Trevor may have more to add.
Well, that would not benefit me being in the cybersecurity industry. I wouldn't like to go back to paper and pen. I think there is no perfect way to protect all systems. It's an impossible task. We have to live with the reality that data breaches will happen. The question is can we reduce the effectiveness of those breaches? Can we blunt the use of that data? And how can we react to that? And how can we ensure that there's an even playing field so we do everything reasonable to protect the information? It's not inconceivable if a nation state that has essentially unlimited funding wants information, they're going to do everything they can to get that. So the military faces the same problem. Our military is being hacked, or hackers are attempting to hack into our military every day. So it's just a question of creating systems in place and putting things in place so that you can minimize the damage to systems to continue forward. I don't think the answer is going backward to, taking information and putting it back on paper It's not conceivable. We can't run our economy that way. We're too far gone.
I would, Perkle, you still got the floor. I would say this as a question in terms of a deterrent. You know, we talked about, we could try to regulate our way to this. I don't think that, I mean, as I unpack this, I don't think regulating your way to this is the solution. You know, as we've had speakers come in over the years and speak to this. You know, we actually had a gentleman, we had a study committee way back in 2006 that dealt with privacy, 11 years ago, and a gentleman came in from the Cato Institute in D.C. and was just talking about different options for this, because you've got so much of this in the private sector marketplace. This isn't just government doing government stuff. It's the private sector doing things that has sort of this national interest. And his question was, if you create the right incentives, it's almost like what you said about the idea of toxicity for data. If you create the right incentives, the right legal structure where financial tort liability exists, that if you do breach, data is breached, there's enough of a financial penalty for that through the kind of legal system and contracts that people are advised to take extra measures because there's a financial interest to do so. There's sort of a free market solution to this by we doing our job as legislators by creating a legal environment that's fair. We don't want to drive out business. We don't want to allow our businesses to be preyed upon legally but at the same time to create this legal environment where there are legal remedies that create market conditions that businesses follow best practices without us having to regulate and requiring them to do that. They just simply, they look at the kind of data they have, they make sober, thoughtful, sort of C-suite kind of decisions about how much money we invest in privacy. And you will have a privacy and protection regime emerge based on best practices because you do have the ability, a consumer does have the ability to bring a suit against someone who has their data without having to prove causality and without having to prove damages if their data has been breached. I mean, I don't know that it's a solvable problem in 5 to 10 years from now for someone to be able to prove that it was the Equifax breach in 2017 that led to this them being harmed. How do we create market forces where businesses and governments are able to make good decisions because we've created a legal set of rules and a playing field for that to work? I don't know that we can do much more than that, but I don't know that we're there yet.
I mean, Trevor was talking about earlier certification. I mean, tax credits, R&D credits for, engaging in cybersecurity activity, research for your own business, spend to address some of these things. I mean, businesses are often in the position of trying to decide in terms of their IT spend, is it going to be to modernize? Is it going to be to, do additional development to keep the business moving? Or is it going to be in the area of security? And so they're trying to make those decisions. And I think if they had a way to sort of, be incentivized or get credit for, putting the focus in those areas, that would be very, very impactful.
So, I do have some other questions.
I just want to add something to in response to that. I feel that there is a need for having a baseline of what is considered to be cybersecurity baseline for all businesses to adhere to. And as much as there should be a risk mitigation strategy, if you don't have a baseline, then you're always going to have people who are going to say, well, I don't feel like I've got that risk, or this is not a standard I have to adhere to. And you see that play out at the federal government level. The federal government recognized that there needed to be a standard, and they institute through the National Institute of Standards, NIST, has put out the Cybersecurity Framework, which is essentially a baseline for how all federal government agencies need to protect themselves. And I think that's a positive step forward. It's telling each of those entities, here is the standard that you need to meet, a minimum standard. And within the standard, it has some adjustments based on risk. But putting something out there would benefit businesses because there are, again, entities out there that are spending a lot of money on cybersecurity, and there are others that are not. And the ones that are not spending money are the ones that are getting breached, and those entities are the ones that are getting away with it, and consumers and the rest of the economy is to the detriment. If you have a baseline, at least everyone's on the same even playing field. It's no different that we're driving down the highway, we all have to obey the speed limit. Everyone knows you go over that, you break the law, there's going to be consequences.
Have you been on interstate lately?
Yeah, I can never actually get to that limit. I've tried, but it's just impossible.
Anything further?
No, sure I gotta go pee.
Okay. I've got a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, so, there's such a myriad of issues. Do you have like model legislation that would work on the low-hanging fruit, or do you recommend that we do like the Cybersecurity Advisory Board and flesh out each path? And I mean, because there is a fine balance between business and consumer, and who's liable and what recourse do consumers have. But at the end of the day, we really need to think about technology as, there's nothing that's going to be 100% foolproof. Right. Just like walking around in the world, there's no guarantee that, somebody's not going to harm you. Right. And so, we have to sort of think about it as just, a different way and level of living. And there's going to be risks in just living in the world today, and we can try to protect that, to as much of a degree as we can, but not, there's nothing that's going to protect a person or their data 100%. So I guess that was more than one question, but.
I mean, it's my contention that it would make you land up with a better product and a better results by collaborating with the business. And doing it in a vacuum won't necessarily achieve the objective, and you won't get necessarily the buy-in. People will do it, but maybe they'll do it in the wrong spirit. If you have collaborative between cybersecurity experts and business and governments, I think you have a great combination to get something done. That's my sort of personal opinion.
We also have we have a cybersecurity in Augusta, but it sounds like it's not going to be nearly enough to accommodate the demand that's coming in that field.
It's not operationalized yet. It's even emerging with how it's going to function. So I think it's a great question. Yeah. Think about what right looks like for us as a state. And,
yeah, I mean, the good news is many people are struggling with this. So in terms of model legislation and standards, I mean, they exist quite substantially. But to your point, I mean, and to Trevor's point, I think it has to be a group, group thought and discussion. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would benefit, I think, everyone to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Anything further?
No.
We have a lot of different industries in Georgia, and those industries need to be accommodated. We have such a diverse economy. All of those different industry groups need to be part of the conversation.
Yeah, because you made a recommend, or you were talking about length of data they can keep, and that's going to be real specific to different industries. I mean, you've got the mortgage industry that's carrying mortgage data for 45 years, and they have to keep it. You can't say, oh, well, you got to get rid of that 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road, because there are industries that have different life cycles that you have to factor in and consider when you try to make regulations around how long someone keeps data. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So anyway, that's it.
Chair recognizes Representative Turner.
One of the things that you started out your presentation by saying was that the data today is the oil of the last century. And so it has inherent value, right? And it's essentially mined in a modern way and collected. But in this particular case, I'm the product. I'm not the consumer, right? And so what are some things that can empower me when there's a breach? I don't have a relationship with Equifax. I don't have a relationship, frankly, with the Secretary of State's office when my Social Security number gets sent out on a CD to whoever. There's nothing I can, when Representative Perkle was talking earlier about I do everything right, are there any legal remedies for me to say, as an individual, I want to address this maybe by empowering me to wipe the data clean, to purge my personal record? Is there anything like that even being discussed?
In Europe. So the general data protection regulation, everything where I think you're going and asking for is addressed in that legislation. The right to be forgotten, erasure, the ability to know what someone has, that they can be able to get rid of it, fines, data protection authorities. I mean, we just do not have the legal infrastructure framework around these areas for consumers that really care about this, that are really concerned to be able to exercise their rights in that regard. It just doesn't exist.
So we don't really have something today, but there's some efforts being made over there that basically, because we were talking just for like really informally, I don't want money. If somebody violates my privacy in this way, I don't want money. I want to be empowered.
Right.
I want to be able to tell the company, you can't do that to me again. I'm a victim, even though I didn't have anything to do with the crime. I'm still the victim, and there's nothing today that empowers me as an individual to say in this country, you don't get to use me as your product anymore.
Right. I mean, even to that point, even more strongly, I mean, it's almost unavoidable, which is even more troubling, right? I mean, even if you wanted to, you may not be able to, and that concerns me. I mean, because if you want to take the position, well, I'm not okay with any of this, then you'd have to move somewhere pretty remote, and
Well, yeah,
destroy your phone,
and then people think you're the Unabomber.
That's exactly right. So there really isn't a good place to go if you're uncomfortable with all this. You're exactly right, and I mean, that's a technological problem, and it's an evolution of the economy, and so these are hard. It's hard, very hard.
But it actually gets even worse than that, is because if a US company has data on an EU citizen, they have to comply with that law. So our economy and our businesses are having the cost associated with that in order to protect EU citizens, but not our own citizens.
Really?
Well, there seems like there
So-
would be a cost factor of making that consistent across the board, so they don't have to have, different processes and procedures for each country.
There is, but when you scan your debit card this morning at the gas station, what he's saying is the same place that managed that is following rules for the transactions in Europe they manage that they don't have to follow for you because they're not required to follow it for you.
Yeah,
So I'm saying it might cost the business less to have consistent processes and standards instead of you've got to have someone that complies with this country and that country and.
But your data can be sold in this country, the European citizens' data cannot. And that's
So the last question for me is, why haven't we adopted that model?
well, this legislation that David was talking about is very new. In fact, it only becomes law in Europe in March of 2018. There have been data privacy laws in Europe that preceded this, but this is kind of the latest revision. And there was an agreement between the United States and Europe called Safe Harbor, which allowed US companies to operate on the same basis with the same protections. But that kind of broke down about a year or so ago through a lawsuit in EU. But anyway, the point is that there is a model there, at least out there, that does address a lot of the things you spoke about, from the EU, and that's something potentially that could be adopted for the US as well.
That's called the Privacy Shield, and you can go to the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Commerce's website and look at the Privacy Shield requirements for U.S. businesses that want to obtain data.
Because in that way, I don't have to prove damages to be made whole, and I don't have to go through any of the legal hoops through a tort process. I just say, look, there's a breach. I want to invoke my rights under this piece of legislation.
Right.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you guys.
Any further questions from members of the committee? I will kind of ask one or two to kind of summarize here, then we can close. I think you hit a question that I was kind of saving to the end. There's really no ability. It doesn't seem like there's a practical ability to drop out. That I could participate or not participate. From my very limited perspective, as just one person among 320 million Americans. I don't know what I would have to do to not have my data slopping around, and how I get out of that. It was said back in the. Let's go way back in history. and I don't want to make a coarse analogy here, but I mean, it was, I remember when you read General Colin Powell's book, he came down from New York with his wife, Alma, in 1958 to go to the officer basic course at Fort Benning, Georgia. He was going to be an officer, serve our country, obviously served with great distinction. And they rolled into Columbus, Georgia in 1958. And they had to sleep in their car because there was not a single hotel that would take them in the current state of the law of the day. No, the thinking in Georgia was, well, you can just find a place that this person can deny you, but you can find a place there's places out there that will take you. But they couldn't find a place that will take them, so they slept in their car. One can say, well, you don't have to participate in commerce with this group of entities, but I don't know if I can drive downtown Atlanta and engage in commerce without a car that doesn't have a tracking device on it,
Right.
without being able to show up on cameras. And we could sort of unpack this level of intrusiveness. I don't know that somebody, even that is committed to this, has a real remedy. We can say sort of, you just need to make decisions to engage in corporations where you can kind of live the lifestyle that you want to live. Go do it. I don't know that that's any more real than finding a hotel that will take in Colin Powell in Columbus, Georgia in 1950. I mean, I don't want to make extreme examples, but it was sort of this legal theory at the time, but in practice, Congress realized in 1964 that doesn't work. You have to have basic access to things that became called public accommodations. Is data not almost a public accommodation setting where there's really no ability to sort of make these kinds of consumer choices? Like, this company's making me share my data with them, so I won't do business with them. I'll just do business with all these other companies that don't make me do that. I don't know that's really an option today.
Yeah.
I don't know that you can go to the grocery store and scan your card or even use or scan your card with a company that's not doing that. So have we created this sort of nullity, this null set of places we can go choose that don't do this? And if it doesn't really exist, then what are we? I think this is kind of where Europe is. Does there not need to be a more sober realization of this? Because this notion, just find a place to do business with, you'll be fine. I don't know that really honestly exists. And what does that mean for us? And I don't think I'll close by saying this. I don't know that we're looking as ambitious legislators to solve every problem and to think through all the data sets that have got to be settled. What about Social Security information? What about photographs? We can never solve that from this dais. I guess the question is, what exists to address this issue? And if there's a rubric that's being done in another modern society of 380 million people, the EU, that we could learn from, that our corporations today are complying with corporations within 10 miles where we're sitting right now are complying with those same standards because they're doing business over there. Is there not a roadmap for us that Ed and Sherry and Scott and all of us don't have to make up in the legislature?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is there is. And, to your point, I mean, at some point, maybe we're just concerned about protecting people from being discriminated against the data that's out there and that can be used, right? I like regular Coke. If I have more than 2 a day and someone knows and tells the insurance company I'm not covered for X, Y, and Z, I mean, those are real concerns that people are going to have and that could eventually have some real consequence. So maybe that's, to your point, where the focus should be.
Well, Representative Gilligan set this meeting up, so I'm going to give her the last word, and then we will stand adjourned. Representative Gilligan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this opportunity to bring this issue to the committee. Thank you all the committee members who came, took time out of your busy schedule to come and listen, and I'm hoping that we can come up with some kind of solution, some way to protect the consumers here in Georgia. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming. In our phone conversations, I was in a lot of phone conversations also with Mr. Horowitz, and I want to thank you so much for taking my calls. One of the comments that I had made was, it was so easy before the age of computers. You told your children, don't talk to strangers. We need to understand now what that means. And I want to thank you, Mr. Katz, for talking about Mr. Halpert's program of the education for children. I'll have to look into that. So thank you for notifying me and letting me know about that.
Yes, my pleasure.
So yes, we want our children to be safe. We know that our children have the Pokemon Go app on their phone, and so there's geo-tracking data going on with our kids as they're trying to catch the latest, greatest Pokemon. So we need to know how to protect them at all times. We also know that the state of Georgia does have a lot of trafficking, especially of our children. So this is a real concern. Anything that we can do to protect our citizens, I'm interested in. I would love to have your phone numbers later. So obviously I have you. I'm almost putting you on speed dial. But I would love to be able to have that contact information, and then I would like to share that with the members of the committee. Again, just thank you so much for this opportunity and for the information you gave us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I'd like to get a copy of the presentation.
Sure.
And we may be reaching out to you again as we sort of formulate and kind of ruminate on this over the next month or two and some weeks. We may reach back out to you. I don't know if you can be a resource. I'm certainly sensitive to asking practicing attorneys to give free time. When you're
It would be my pleasure. It would be my pleasure, my honor, frankly. Thank you.
So with that, we stand adjourned.